They say that when the blade meets the neck, the mind does not die at once. For several impossible seconds, consciousness lingers, a flicker of self, trapped between life and oblivion. The eyes still search for light. The lips still tremble with unfinished prayer. The body still protests, unaware that its rebellion is futile. That brief, unbearable space between heartbeat and nothingness belonged to Anne Boleyn, once crowned Queen of England, now condemned traitor to her own crown. At Tower Green, where the morning fog coiled around the low scaffold, she waited for the sound of footsteps that would end her existence. They came softly, as if afraid to disturb the ritual. In the chill of the 19th of May, 1536, London stirred beneath a grey sky. The ravens at the tower had already begun their harsh chorus, their black wings slicing through the mist like omens. Anne had not slept. All night she had knelt on the cold stone floor, whispering prayers into darkness that refused to answer. When dawn broke, pale and indifferent, she rose to meet it, not as a queen, but as a body to be offered. The guards entered without a word. They did not bow. They no longer saw a woman who had once changed the course of a kingdom. They saw a symbol to be erased, a caution written in flesh. Her hands trembled, yet her voice did not. Those who attended her later swore she smiled, as though her mind had already crossed a threshold where fear could not follow. But that composure was a mask, the final performance demanded by a king who had turned her life into theater. Outside, the crowd gathered. Merchants, courtiers, wives, clutching their children, all drawn by curiosity, masquerading as justice. They whispered that the French swordsman had arrived, summoned at great expense to grant a merciful death. They did not see the cruelty in that word. A foreign blade, imported spectacle, another layer of humiliation. Anne stepped into the morning like an actress walking onto a stage built for her. Ruin. Every sound, the scrape of boots, the clink of armor, the far-off tolling of church bells, carved itself into her final memory. She would not be granted the dignity of darkness. Her death would unfold in full daylight, under the eyes of a nation trained to look away from truth. And as she reached the scaffold, the wind caught her veil, lifting it for a moment, a fleeting image of the woman who had once defied a king, loved too boldly, and paid the price for both. It was said that when the blade finally fell, it was silent, almost elegant. But there is nothing merciful about silence. It only hides the echo of what was taken. Long before the scaffold was built, the story of Anne Boleyn's undoing had already begun to unfold quietly, methodically, and with the precision of a political autopsy. To understand her final morning, one must return to the corridors of Whitehall Palace, where ambition first whispered her name. She had once been the most dazzling woman in England, not by beauty alone, but by intellect, wit, and the dangerous art of fascination. In the glittering world of the Tudor court, she was both flame and moth, drawing others in even as she drifted toward her own destruction. Henry VIII saw in her not merely desire but promise, the chance to birth a son, to secure a dynasty, to shape the realm in his image. And for a brief, blazing moment, Anne seemed untouchable. But power in Tudor England was never a possession. It was a loan paid in loyalty and silence. Anne had neither. She challenged, questioned, laughed too freely. She dared to argue theology with a king, to mock his counselors, to speak when obedience was expected. Every word she uttered carved a small wound into the pride of those who surrounded her. And at court, wounds became weapons. By 1536, the devotion that had once rewritten England's religion turned into disgust, whispered behind silk sleeves, Henry's eyes had shifted toward Jane Seymour, soft-spoken and submissive, the very opposite of Anne's defiance. A queen who had risen through rebellion could not survive in an empire built on control, so the stage was prepared for her fall. Thomas Cromwell, the king's minister, understood that to destroy Anne, one must first destroy the idea of her. Accusations of adultery, incest, and witchcraft were woven with care, stitched into the fabric of official record. Each name, each supposed lover, was chosen to humiliate, to transform the queen into a monster of the crown's own making. And as the rumors spread, they achieved what no army could. They made the people complicit in her death. The arrest came in May. Anne was seized during a game of tennis, laughter still echoing from the courtyard. By nightfall, she was inside the Tower of London, escorted through the same gates where she had once entered as a radiant bride-to-be. The irony was almost theatrical. The fortress that had once symbolized triumph now became a tomb still waiting for its occupant. Inside her chamber, stripped of attendants and finery, she began to comprehend the machinery of power closing around her. Letters went unanswered. Allies vanished. Even her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presided over the trial that would condemn her. History often paints Tudor executions as swift acts of justice, but Anne's was something colder, a ritual of erasure, orchestrated in slow motion. The court that judged her was not assembled for truth. It was constructed for theater. Witnesses recited rehearsed lies. Judges nodded in predetermined rhythm. Every gesture, every pause, was part of a choreography meant to give tyranny the appearance of law. When the verdict was read, guilty of treason against the king's person, she merely smiled, not in disbelief, but in the hollow recognition that the play had reached its final act. Outside, London pulsed with rumors. Some wept for their queen, others rejoiced at her fall. The same mouths that had once shouted her praises now cursed her name. That was the genius of Tudor propaganda. It could turn love into hatred overnight and make the crowd believe both were righteous. As the days dragged on, Anne waited. Her execution was postponed repeatedly, a cruelty disguised as mercy. Each morning she awoke, uncertain whether she would still draw breath by dusk. She prayed, she sang hymns softly under her breath, and at times she laughed a brittle sound that frightened even her guards. Her calmness was not peace, it was surrender to inevitability. By the eve of her death, the tower had grown eerily silent. Even the ravens seemed to keep their distance. The carpenters worked through the night to raise the small wooden platform at Tower Green. It stood low to the ground, barely 3 feet high, close enough for the crowd to see her face when the sword came down. It was built not for dignity, but for spectacle. And as dawn crept once more across the stone walls, Anne prepared herself, as she always had, with grace, precision, and an unyielding awareness that even her last breath would serve another man's story. In a kingdom ruled by fear, her composure was the last rebellion she could offer. But beneath the calm surface, something deeper stirred a terror that no prayer could still. Tomorrow, the performance would begin, and she, once again, would be the leading role in a play written by power and ended by silence. The greatest cruelty of Anne Boleyn's death was not the sword. It was the waiting, the endless, hollow stretch of hours between condemnation and release, when time itself became a weapon. Each dawn, the sound of keys turning in her lock was a question. Is it today? And each dusk that passed without an answer felt like mockery from a god gone silent. Anne was kept in the Queen's lodgings within the Tower chambers once prepared for her coronation, now her cell. The same walls that had witnessed her triumph would now witness her unmaking. The windows were barred, the corridor heavily guarded, yet it was not iron that imprisoned her most. It was uncertainty. The mind can endure pain when it knows its end. It collapses when it doesn't. The courtiers called the delay the king's mercy. In truth, it was psychological torture, refined by protocol and faith. Henry's council postponed her execution several times, claiming the French swordsman had not yet arrived. But the man had been waiting in London for days. The real reason for the delay was crueler. Henry wanted her to know that she was powerless, that even her death would occur only at his convenience. Anne filled those suspended days with fragments of routine, brushing her hair, reciting prayers, instructing her attendants to write farewell letters she was not allowed to send. When she laughed, it startled the guards. When she wept, it frightened them more. They could not tell which mask was real, and perhaps neither could she. A priest visited her often. He recorded that she seemed composed, but her eyes betrayed her restless, unfocused, circling the room as though searching for something she'd lost. She spoke of her daughter, Elizabeth. She asked that the child be treated kindly. She asked it twice, as if repetition could bend the will of a king. Outside, London feasted. The merchants sold commemorative prints of her face. Ballads circulated through taverns, twisting her story into farce. Already, she was becoming legend, and legends in Tudor England were crafted not by poets, but by politicians. Every lie spoken about her was another brick in the monument of her disgrace. Anne understood that humiliation was part of the ritual. She had seen others destroyed before, nobles stripped of title, clergy branded heretics, women branded whores, but she had never imagined herself as the spectacle. Her fall had to be theatrical, because her rise had been unprecedented. For Henry to appear just, she must appear wicked. So the execution was delayed again to ensure that every courtier, every bishop, every citizen who had once admired her would have time to believe the lies. At night, she dreamed of freedom, not as escape, but as silence, an end to the noise of accusation that filled her waking hours. She told her maids that she saw angels in her sleep, that she heard music from heaven. Some believed she had gone mad. Others thought she was already half a saint. But what she truly sought was distance to be anywhere but here, in this slow suffocation masquerading as justice. On the final night, she confessed to her confessor that she was prepared to die. But even those words, so composed, carried the tremor of exhaustion. Preparedness was the only thing left to control. She had been queen, lover, heretic, prisoner. Now she would be performance. She told her maids to dress her carefully in the morning. Let no man say the Queen of England met death unfitly. It was vanity, perhaps, or armor. In Tudor England, dignity was the last privilege denied to the condemned. The hours before dawn were thick with silence. The tower's ravens croaked above the battlements. Some said they could sense blood. Anne walked the length of her chamber, whispering prayers, touching the walls as if memorizing them. Each step echoed the rhythm of her heartbeat. Each breath was a countdown. She asked once more to see her brother's grave, a request refused. He had been executed days earlier, accused of incest with her, his sister. Even death could not absolve them of the king's design. She stood at the window and whispered into the fog, perhaps speaking to him, perhaps to God, perhaps to no one at all. What haunted her most was not dying. It was the knowledge that history would not remember the truth, that the woman she was clever, flawed human would be replaced by an image sculpted by fear. Already, the crown's scribes were rewriting her story. Already, sermons were being prepared that would call her fall divine justice. In her final hours, Anne did not pray for salvation. She prayed to be remembered. And as the first light of morning crept through the slit in her cell wall, she understood that memory itself was a battlefield, and she had already lost. Tomorrow, the sword would fall. But tonight, the kingdom rehearsed its silence. The morning of May 19th, 1536, broke with cruel serenity. The sky above the Tower of London was washed in a cold blue haze, the kind that made stone gleam like polished bone. From her narrow window, Anne could hear the faint hum of a crowd assembling beyond the green. They were murmuring not with grief, but with anticipation, the morbid rhythm of an audience awaiting a play. Her maids dressed her in a dark gray gown trimmed with ermine. Her sleeves fitted close, her hood pinned precisely. A crimson kirtle lay hidden beneath, glimpsed only when she moved, the color of martyrdom, though no priest would call it that. She tied her hair into a tight braid to keep it from the blade. When one of her attendants began to weep, Anne smiled faintly. "Do not cry," she said, her voice clear but small. "This is not the end." It was a lie, she told, for their sake a fragment of comfort in a room that no longer contained hope. But perhaps, in some buried corner of her soul, she believed it. A knock at the door. The lieutenant of the tower entered, head bowed. "It is time, Your Grace." The words were formal, detached, but his eyes betrayed pity. Anne nodded once. She did not falter. To stumble now would mean surrender, and she would not give Henry that satisfaction. As she stepped into the corridor, sunlight slanted through arrow-slit windows, striping the floor in gold and shadow. Each step echoed with a gravity that belonged to ritual, not life. At the foot of the stair, the sound of the crowd grew louder, the shifting of hundreds of feet, the rustle of cloaks, the cough of anticipation. Londoners had come to see the end of the woman who had once unmade a queen, defied a pope, and birthed a future monarch. They would watch, and then they would forget. The scaffold at Tower Green was small, lower than tradition demanded, a deliberate humiliation. Its boards were newly scrubbed, but faint stains lingered from the executions of days past. Nearby, the headsman stood waiting, a Frenchman dressed in black, his sword gleaming like glass in the weak light. Unlike the English axe, his weapon was elegant, designed to separate head from body in one swift motion. Henry had paid handsomely for this refinement. They called it mercy. Anne mounted the steps alone. The wind tugged at her gown, lifting the hem just enough to reveal the red beneath. Around her, courtiers and officials stood in rigid formation. Among them were faces she had once known, ambassadors, noblewomen, men who had once sworn loyalty at her coronation. Now, their eyes were averted, their expressions carved from stone. None dared to look long, as though guilt itself could be contagious. When the noise of the crowd died down, she began to speak. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die according to the law." Her voice did not tremble. She praised the king, called him merciful, thanked God for the chance to die cleanly. Each word was chosen with surgical precision, an act of self-control so absolute that it became terrifying. To the crowd, it sounded submissive. But those who listened carefully could hear defiance beneath the courtesy. She confessed no crime. She gave Henry his spectacle, but not his victory. When she finished, the silence hung heavy. Only the wind answered. Then, As was custom, she removed her cloak and handed it to her maid. The woman's hands shook so violently that Anne steadied them. "Do not be afraid," she whispered. "It will be soon." The blindfold was a strip of white linen. As it was tied around her eyes, the world narrowed to darkness and breath. The headsman knelt before her and asked forgiveness. Anne's reply was soft. "I willingly forgive you. I pray you dispatch me quickly." The words of a queen, even now. She knelt upright, not laid upon a block, but upright, according to French custom. Her spine straight, her chin lifted slightly. Her lips moved in silent prayer. Those nearest said they saw her mouth the words, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul." The headsman turned to his assistant and called out in French, "Bring me my sword." It was a trick. The sword was already in his hand. The call was meant to distract her, to keep her from tensing. As she turned her head instinctively toward the sound, he struck. The blade moved so fast it made no sound. Only the dull thud of metal meeting flesh, then wood. Her body remained kneeling for a fraction of a second, a grotesque posture of devotion before collapsing sideways, the gown folding over itself like extinguished flame. Her head rolled to one side, the braids still coiled neatly, the lips still faintly parted. Witnesses swore the eyes blinked twice. Some said they moved as if searching for heaven. A gasp rippled through the crowd. One woman fainted, another began to sob. But most stood silent, frozen in that brief, terrible moment when the mind cannot decide whether to feel awe or horror. The headsman lifted her head by the hair and held it high. "Behold the head of a traitor!" the voice carried across the courtyard, cutting through the wind. Blood still streamed from the neck, bright and shocking against the pale morning. It stained the boards beneath her body, pooled into the cracks, and ran toward the edge of the scaffold. No coffin had been prepared. No priest stepped forward to bless the remains. Her attendants, pale and trembling, wrapped her body in white cloth torn from their own garments. They found an old arrow chest in a nearby storeroom and placed her inside. The chest was too small. Her limbs had to be folded awkwardly to fit. Then they carried her to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula and buried her beneath the flagstones, without inscription or ceremony. A Queen of England, entombed like contraband. The crowd began to disperse, their murmurs fading into the cold air. Within an hour, the green was empty. By afternoon, life at court had resumed. Henry rode to Whitehall to dine with Jane Seymour. The pageant was over. The erasure had begun. What remained on the scaffold was not a body, but a warning, a silent decree carved into England's memory. That power, when threatened, will always disguise cruelty as law. The execution ended, but the performance did not. In Tudor England, death was not the conclusion of a sentence. It was the beginning of a story, rewritten by those who survived. Anne Boleyn's fall was orchestrated not only on the scaffold, but in the silence that followed. Silence, after all, was the most obedient form of propaganda. Within hours of her death, Henry VIII had ordered her name removed from court documents. Her servants were dismissed, her household disbanded, her initials scraped from palace walls. The intertwined H and A, carved into the wood of Hampton Court, were chiseled out, replaced by the letter of another woman, Jane Seymour, his new bride-to-be. A kingdom that had once worshipped Anne now acted as though she had never existed. That was the true punishment, erasure. Not the sword, but the deliberate unmaking of a person, their voice, their image, their very shape in history. Anne's portraits were taken down from royal galleries, some burned, others altered. Painters were ordered to depict only loyal queens, docile, fertile, pious. None of those words had ever described her. In sermons across England, priests preached her death as divine justice. They spoke of adultery, of witchcraft, of God's vengeance against arrogance. They did not mention that the charges were fabricated. They did not say that the evidence had been rehearsed. The Church, newly bent to Henry's will, found in Anne's destruction a convenient moral obedience, sanctified, defiance damned. For the women of her court, the days after the execution were unbearable. They had seen the Queen's head fall, heard the dull sound of it striking the boards, smelled the iron tang of blood. Yet they were expected to serve at dinner that same night, smiling, silent. Some later confessed that they could still hear the echo of the sword in their dreams. One lady, Mary Wyatt, withdrew from court entirely, taking vows in a convent. Others stayed, hiding their terror behind perfect curtsies. In Henry's England, fear was the truest mark of loyalty. The cruelty extended even to the innocent. Little Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was stripped of her title, her household dismantled. She was declared illegitimate, no longer princess, but Lady Elizabeth. Her clothes were taken, her tutors dismissed. The child who might have been heir to the throne was now a political inconvenience, a living reminder of the woman the king wanted forgotten. Anne's family fared no better. Her father, once proud and ambitious, fell from grace, avoided the court that had once applauded him. Her brother, George Boleyn, lay in the same chapel vault as she, accused of incest in a trial that even Henry's allies had found absurd. Their names became whispers, their lineage a curse. In the weeks that followed, Henry married Jane Seymour with indecent haste. The wedding took place only 11 days after Anne's death. While Londoners still gossiped about the spectacle at Tower Green, the bells rang again, this time for celebration. The king smiled, feasted, and promised stability. But beneath the surface, something darker festered. Every Tudor subject understood the message. If a crowned queen could be unmade, no one was safe. Fear spread like smoke through the kingdom. Courtiers learned to lower their eyes, to speak softly, to avoid the subject of the dead queen altogether. Her friends destroyed letters, burned tokens of affection, erased their own traces of loyalty. History became a house cleaned of her memory. Only a few dared to mourn. The poet Thomas Wyatt, who had once admired her, wrote from the Tower, "These bloody days have broken my heart." His words were never spoken aloud. To grieve for Anne was to risk following her to the block. The Tower itself seemed changed. Those who entered afterward swore the place had grown colder. Guards reported hearing footsteps near the green, the sound of silk dragging across the stones when no one was there. Some claimed the ravens refused to roost where she had fallen. Superstition wrapped around the memory of her death like fog, not because people believed she haunted the place, but because they feared she might still matter. And yet, in destroying her, Henry created something he could not control: fascination. The same court that had condemned her could not stop speaking of her beauty, her wit, her composure at death. They had meant to erase her, but they had made her myth. In whispers, people began to call her the queen who smiled at the sword. Her silence became eloquence. Her ruin became immortality. History would later tidy her story, make it cleaner, simpler, the ambitious woman punished by fate. But the truth was uglier, and far more human. Anne Boleyn did not die for treason, or for adultery, or for witchcraft. She died because she had been loved too much, feared too deeply, and remembered too vividly. And that combination, in Henry's England, was treason enough. Centuries have passed since the morning the sword fell, yet Anne Boleyn refuses to disappear. The very erasure Henry demanded became the foundation of her endurance. Every attempt to silence her memory only sharpened it, carving her name deeper into the story of England than any monument could. Her daughter, Elizabeth I, would become the living contradiction of Henry's verdict. The child he stripped of legitimacy rose to define an age, the Elizabethan era, when England flourished in culture, faith, and power. Each triumph of Elizabeth's reign was an unspoken rebuke to the father who had condemned her mother. In portraits, Elizabeth wore jewels shaped like suns and moons, symbols of eternal light. Yet hidden within those symbols was a quieter inheritance: her mother's courage, her mother's silence, her mother's understanding of how power and fear entwine. Anne's story survived not in official chronicles, but in whispers and legends, in the tremor of awe that accompanied her name. At Hever Castle, where she once grew up, visitors claimed the corridors still carried the faint scent of roses after rain, her favorite bloom. At the tower, guides spoke of a woman in gray wandering the green, her head held high, her step unbroken even in death. Whether ghost or myth, she became a reminder of something England could never quite bury: conscience. Artists, historians, and playwrights have long struggled to define her. To some, she was the serpent who tempted a king; to others, the victim of a tyrant's insecurity. But the truth lies somewhere between those extremes: a woman both brilliant and doomed, whose intelligence outpaced the world that sought to contain her. Anne had wielded charm like a weapon, politics like language, faith like a veil, and for that, she was destroyed. But in destruction, she achieved the very immortality Henry denied her. Her execution changed England in ways no decree could. It exposed the fragility of royal justice, the cost of ambition, the danger of being indispensable to a king. It revealed that even at the height of empire, power was built not on righteousness but on fear, and it began a legacy that would haunt every Tudor who followed. Mary, the Catholic queen, would burn heretics in the name of order. Elizabeth, the Protestant queen, would guard her throne with ruthless suspicion. Both were shaped by the shadow of the mother who had died for daring to think herself equal to a man. Today, her story is retold in films, novels, and classrooms, yet it remains curiously modern. The machinery that condemned her rumor, performance, control of narrative still echoes in every age that confuses justice with spectacle. Anne Boleyn was not merely executed, she was edited, and her greatest victory is that the edit never held. When visitors stand before her resting place in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the stone bears no inscription of rank or glory, only her name, simple, unadorned. Perhaps that is fitting, for beneath the legend and the lies, Anne's truest legacy is not the scandal or the crown, but the defiance of a voice that refused to vanish. Hold that image a moment longer: a woman kneeling on a scaffold, the wind lifting the edge of her gown, the crowd silent as steel flashes once. History would like us to stop there, to close the story neatly, as if the fall of the blade was the end of meaning. But Anne Boleyn's death was never just about one woman. It was about the machinery that decides who deserves to be remembered and who deserves to be erased. When we speak her name now, we are not just recalling a Tudor queen. We are confronting the architecture of power that built her destruction, a system where narrative was weapon, where faith served ambition, where a king's will rewrote reality. The same impulses linger still, to condemn inconvenient voices, to polish cruelty into ceremony, to disguise vengeance as law. Anne's story endures because it reveals how fragile truth becomes when power owns the script. In the centuries since, historians have tried to soften her image, to make her palatable. They've turned her into romance, into tragedy, into lesson. But beneath the embroidery of myth lies something raw, a woman punished for the audacity of thought, for refusing to be silent in a world that rewarded silence. That defiance, more than her beauty or wit, was what terrified Henry most. The sword took her life, but not her meaning. In every retelling, she stands again at the edge of the scaffold, eyes open beneath the blindfold of history. Each generation rediscovers her, and in doing so, exposes its own fears about gender, control, and the cost of truth. To remember her is to refuse the comfort of forgetting. It is to admit that progress is fragile, that injustice often wears the face of authority, that every age builds its own tower. Perhaps that is why her story haunts, because it reminds us that erasure is never complete, that even in silence there are echoes, that memory, however bloodied, is resistance. Anne Boleyn's death was meant to end a rebellion. Instead, it began one that has never truly ceased. The rebellion of memory against power, of voice against decree, of truth against the versions written by kings. And so, 5 centuries later, the question remains, when the next blade falls, whose story will we believe?